The limousine driver locked the doors, pulled behind an abandoned warehouse, and pointed at the open trunk as if he had been waiting all morning to bury me. "Get in," he said. I reached for the handle, but the locks clicked again. Then he leaned close enough for me to smell coffee on his breath and whispered, "Don't say anything. If you want to live, trust me." My daughter's wedding ceremony was 58 minutes away. I was wearing a navy suit my late wife had chosen before she died, and inside my jacket was a cashier's check covering the final wedding balance. I thought the stranger in front of me wanted money. Then a black sedan rolled slowly past the alley entrance, its driver watching us through tinted glass. The limousine driver shoved me into the trunk, lowered the lid, and said, "They only need to know which car you're in." That was the moment I understood this wasn't a robbery. Someone expected me to die before I reached the altar. My name is Walter Mercer, and until that morning, I believed the most dangerous mistake I had made was spoiling my only child. Stay with me, because the people waiting at that wedding had planned more than a ceremony. To understand why, I have to go back 3 months. Emily announced her engagement on a Sunday afternoon in my kitchen, standing beneath the copper light fixture her mother had bought in Charleston 30 years earlier. She was 34, smart, graceful, and nervous in the way she always became when she wanted my approval, but resented needing it. Grant Holloway stood beside her with one hand resting lightly at the small of her back. He was 38, tall, well-groomed, and careful with every word. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I know how much Emily means to you. I'm not asking you to trust me overnight. I'm asking for the chance to earn it." Most men would have called that respectful. I heard preparation. Still, I shook his hand. Emily had spent years moving from one uncertain job to another. And after her mother, Margaret, died, I had watched loneliness settle into her life like dust on unused furniture. Grant seemed steady. He worked as an independent investment advisor, wore modest suits, listened more than he spoke, and remembered small details. He knew I preferred black coffee and that Margaret had loved gardenias. I wanted to believe that meant he paid attention. I did not yet understand that attention and affection can look identical when a man is studying the locks on your doors. I had spent most of my working life investigating railway accidents. I learned to distrust simple explanations, especially when expensive people offered them quickly. A cracked wheel was rarely just a cracked wheel. Somewhere behind it was a missed inspection, a changed report, a supervisor protecting a schedule, or an executive deciding that delay cost more than danger. Yet with my family, I ignored the instincts that had kept strangers alive. I had missed birthdays while inspecting derailments in winter storms. I had arrived late to school plays and tried to make up for it with vacations, tuition checks, and a down payment on Emily's first condo. After Margaret died, I became worse. Every time Emily stumbled, I removed the ground beneath her before she could learn to stand. When her event planning business failed, I paid the vendors. When she left a job after 6 months, I covered her mortgage. I told myself I was protecting my daughter. Margaret once told me, "Walt, there's a difference between helping Emily and making sure she never has to face herself." I had dismissed it as the worry of a mother. By the time I recognized the truth, Margaret had been gone 3 years, and Emily had learned that love often arrived with my signature at the bottom of a check. The wedding grew from a small garden ceremony into a 2-day event at Hawthorne Ridge, a restored estate outside Richmond. Emily wanted white roses, a string quartet, custom lighting, and a reception tent overlooking the river. Grant protested each expense just enough to appear reasonable, then quietly supported whatever made Emily happy. I paid the deposits. By the final month, the total had reached $186,000. I also cleared the remaining $22,000 on Emily's student loans and offered the couple temporary use of the guest house on my property. "Just until we find our footing," Emily said. Grant thanked me, but his eyes moved past the guest house toward the main house, the barns, and the tree line beyond them. A week later, while we reviewed catering invoices, he asked, "Is all this held personally?" Or through the Mercer Trust? His tone was casual. His knowledge was not. I answered that the property was protected and changed the subject. 2 days later, he asked how voting shares in Mercer Freight would transfer when I retired. I told myself financial advisors were naturally curious. The truth was simpler. I liked him because Emily smiled around him, and I was willing to excuse any question that kept that smile in the room. My younger brother Richard encouraged the match from the beginning. At 63, he had served as chief financial officer of Mercer Freight Holdings for 22 years. I owned the controlling interest, but Richard understood the company's books better than anyone alive. We had inherited a struggling regional freight operation from our father and built it into a profitable logistics business with 6 terminals across Virginia and North Carolina. I made the operational decisions. Richard managed the numbers. That arrangement had worked until the previous year, when he proposed selling to Harland Logistics for $31 million. I rejected the offer because Harland intended to consolidate routes and cut more than 100 jobs. Richard called me sentimental. I called him impatient. We did not speak for 2 weeks. After Emily's engagement, he became unusually warm again. Maybe it's time to let the next generation breathe. He told me during a family dinner, "You've carried everyone long enough." Grant nodded without looking at me. Emily stared at her plate. I should have asked why a conversation about marriage had become a conversation about my control. Instead, I poured more wine and said I had no plans to die on anyone's schedule. The first document appeared 6 weeks before the wedding. Emily brought it to my office in a cream folder and placed it between us. "It's just a medical power of attorney," she said. "Grant thinks every family should have one." I read every page. The first section was ordinary. The second allowed Emily to make medical decisions if I became incapacitated. The third went further. It authorized her to petition for temporary control over assets connected to the Mercer Family Trust if 2 physicians certified cognitive decline. "Who drafted this?" I asked. She hesitated before saying Grant had recommended an estate planning service. I closed the folder. "I already have documents with Denise Parker." Emily's expression tightened. "Your lawyer protects you." "Dad, this protects us." The word "us" landed harder than she intended. I asked whether she believed I was losing my mind. She said no, then reminded me I had forgotten a lunch appointment and misplaced my keys after Margaret's memorial service. Grief had made me distracted, not incompetent. But Emily's eyes filled with tears, and I did what I had always done when she was hurt. I softened instead of setting a boundary. I told her I would review it later. I should have handed it back and asked why my future son-in-law was preparing for my incapacity before he had even married my daughter. 3 days later, Richard raised the same subject during a board meeting. He waited until the other directors had left, then closed the conference room door. "You need a transition plan," he said, "not because anything is wrong, but because uncertainty damages valuation." I reminded him I was chairman, not a defective machine waiting for replacement. Richard tapped his ring against the walnut table, a habit he had carried since our father gave it to him. "You're 68. Walt, you lost Margaret. You've been under strain. Nobody is accusing you of anything." It was the kind of sentence people use immediately before accusing you of something. I asked whether he had discussed my health with Grant. Richard looked offended. "Grant understands financial risk. That doesn't make him an enemy." I watched his ring tap twice more against the table. Metallic, sharp, evenly spaced. The sound bothered me without giving me a reason. When I returned home that night, I found Emily and Grant in my study. Grant said they were looking for an old photograph of Margaret for the wedding memorial table. The photograph albums were in the living room. My trust documents were in the locked cabinet behind my desk. The cabinet was closed, but the key had been moved. I changed the lock the next morning and told no one. That was my first quiet act of suspicion, and it embarrassed me. I had spent decades teaching accident investigators to preserve evidence, yet I still wanted a harmless explanation. Perhaps Emily had been searching for her mother's letters. Perhaps Grant had mistaken the cabinet for storage. Perhaps Richard's questions were only business. Doubt becomes dangerous when it conflicts with the person you want to be. I wanted to be a generous father, a loyal brother, and a man wise enough not to confuse age with paranoia. So I continued paying vendors. I approved the final floral contract. I met Grant for lunch and allowed him to discuss consolidating my investment accounts. He said separate accounts made estate administration difficult. I told him the Mercer Family Trust held approximately $8.4 million in property, securities, and business interests, but that Emily's future beneficiary status gave her no present control. He smiled and said, "Of course, I'm only thinking about protecting her." Then he asked whether the trust could replace its manager during a medical emergency. I answered, "Only if someone proves the manager can no longer protect himself." Grant lowered his eyes to his plate, but not before I saw satisfaction flicker across his face. The forged signature appeared 10 days before the wedding. Denise Parker called me at 7 in the morning and asked whether I had authorized a preliminary petition to transfer temporary management of the trust. Denise had been my attorney for 19 years. She did not dramatize problems. When she sounded worried, I listened. She emailed me a scanned document bearing my name, my address, and a signature close enough to fool someone who had never watched me sign. The petition stated that I had voluntarily approved a competency review and agreed that Emily could assume emergency authority if I failed to attend 2 scheduled assessments. I had never seen it. Worse, the document included the last 4 digits of a private trust account and a reference to a clause not included in public records. Only Denise, Richard, Emily, and I had received full copies. I drove to Emily's apartment without calling. Grant opened the door wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. Emily stood behind him. When I showed them the document, she went pale. Grant remained calm. "This could be an administrative draft," he said. I asked how an administrative draft acquired my forged signature. Emily whispered, "Dad, please don't make this ugly before the wedding." That sentence crossed the last boundary. Someone had forged my name, and my daughter's first concern was keeping the flowers standing. I did not shout. Years of accident investigations had taught me that angry men reveal more than calm ones, but only when the calm man lets silence work. I placed the document on their kitchen counter and asked Emily one question. "Did you give Grant a copy of the trust?" She looked toward him before answering. That glance told me more than her words. "I showed him parts of it," she admitted. "We're getting married. I shouldn't have to hide my future from my husband." Grant stepped forward and said, "I was treating her like a child." He accused me of using money to control every relationship in the family. The accusation hurt because it contained enough truth to carry the lie beside it. I told Emily the wedding bills would still be paid, but all changes involving the trust were suspended. She began crying. Grant wrapped an arm around her and said, "This is exactly what we talked about." I asked what that meant. He replied, "That when you felt challenged, you would punish her financially." I left without taking the forged document. That was a mistake. By afternoon, Emily said she could not find it. Grant claimed I had carried it away. For the first time, I understood they were no longer simply asking for my trust. They were preparing a story in which I could not trust my own memory. On the morning of the wedding, Richard arrived at my house before 8. He wore a gray morning coat and carried 2 cups of coffee. "Whatever happened with Emily, don't ruin today," he said. I told him I had no intention of ruining anything. I planned to walk my daughter down the aisle, pay what I had promised, and speak with Denise the following morning. Richard relaxed too quickly. He mentioned that the limousine company had experienced a scheduling problem and that I might need to transfer to a sedan near the church. I asked how he knew. He said Emily had told him. 20 minutes later, Emily called and repeated the same explanation almost word for word. The limousine would collect me, but if traffic became heavy, a backup driver would take me along River Road. I had investigated enough staged accidents to dislike last-minute vehicle changes. Still, I told myself no one in my family would risk my life over a trust. That belief survived until I met the driver. His name was Caleb Ross. He checked the underside of the limousine before opening my door, then scanned the road behind us twice. When I asked whether something was wrong, he said, "Not yet." We drove 6 miles in silence before the black sedan appeared. Inside the trunk, every turn threw my shoulder against the wheel well. I counted seconds to estimate speed and direction. The lining had been partially removed, giving me access to an emergency release. But Caleb had secured it with a plastic tie. He had planned this carefully. My phone vibrated again and again. Emily called 4 times. Richard called twice. Grant sent one message, "Where are you? We're holding the ceremony." Caleb's voice came through the rear seats. "Do not answer." I shouted that he had 30 seconds to explain himself before I tore through the release. He braked hard, opened the trunk, and showed me his own phone. A message displayed a photograph of the black sedan beside the church, followed by instructions: confirm Mercer transfers to Unit 2. Route him past river marker 17. Caleb said he had been hired to create a mechanical excuse, move me into the sedan, and continue driving the limousine as a decoy. Yesterday I inspected Unit 2. He told me someone installed a remote actuator on the brake line at the river curve. You wouldn't make the guardrail. I asked why he had not called police. He showed me a second message containing a photograph of his younger brother leaving a gambling room and a threat to put him in prison, or worse, if Caleb failed. We reached an abandoned Mercer freight maintenance garage 30 minutes from the estate. I recognized it immediately. The company had closed the facility 4 years earlier, but Richard still controlled the property records. Caleb drove inside and shut the bay door. The black sedan was waiting under a tarp. He removed it and showed me a compact device attached near the braking assembly, with wiring running toward a receiver hidden beneath the dashboard. I knelt beside the wheel, ignoring the dirt on my wedding trousers. The installation was crude but functional. It had not been designed to disable the brakes permanently. It had been designed to create failure at a chosen moment. Caleb said he had recorded part of a conversation while the men preparing the sedan believed the limousine camera was off. He played the audio. One voice said, "When he changes cars, make sure the river route is clear." Another answered, "The old man won't question it if the instructions come from his daughter." I recognized Grant's measured tone in the first voice. Then came the tapping sound, metal striking wood twice, pausing, then striking again. Richard's ring. I felt something inside me go still. Caleb's phone lit up before I could speak. A new message appeared from a contact saved only as R.M. Has the car left the church? Don't let my brother reach the ceremony. For nearly a minute, neither Caleb nor I spoke. The message on his phone remained bright between us. 6 ordinary words that dismantled 63 years of brotherhood. Don't let my brother reach the ceremony. I wanted to believe R.M. stood for someone else, that Caleb had labeled the contact himself, that the tapping in the recording was coincidence, but Richard had mentioned the vehicle change before anyone else, and the garage belonged to Mercer Freight. Rage would have been easier than doubt. Rage gives a man somewhere to stand. Doubt leaves him balancing over every memory he has ever trusted. I asked Caleb whether he had seen the sender's number. He shook his head and said the messages arrived through an encrypted application that hid the source. Then we don't know it's Richard, I said, though I heard how weak the defense sounded. Caleb answered, "No, sir, but whoever it is knows you're his brother, knows the wedding schedule, and has access to this garage." My phone vibrated again inside my jacket. Emily's name filled the screen. Every instinct in me wanted to answer, hear her voice, and demand the truth. Caleb reached for my wrist. "If they hear you breathing, they'll know the plan failed." Caleb explained that the limousine carried a tracking unit monitored by the dispatch company, while the sedan's receiver was linked to a separate phone he had been ordered to place inside the glove box. The people watching us expected the limousine to continue toward the church after I transferred vehicles. If we stopped too long, they would know something had changed. I asked what he intended to do. He said he would drive the empty limousine past 2 traffic cameras near Hawthorne Ridge, then leave it in a shopping center lot with the doors unlocked. That would create confusion about where I had disappeared. I told him confusion would bring police, news stations, and questions that could damage the company. He looked at me as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. "Sir, somebody rigged a car to send you into a river, and you're worried about quarterly confidence." His bluntness stung because it was deserved. My whole life, I had solved danger by calculating consequences. In that garage, calculation became a shield against accepting what my family might have done. I finally said, "We do it your way for 1 hour. Then I speak to my attorney." Caleb nodded. but his expression told me he did not believe 1 hour would be enough. We removed my jacket, too, and wedding boutonniere, so no camera would capture me through the garage windows. Caleb found an old Mercer freight coverall in a locker and handed it to me. The name stitched over the pocket belonged to a mechanic who had retired 7 years earlier. I changed in the office, while Caleb photographed the brake device from multiple angles. He did not touch the wiring. That impressed me. A guilty man might destroy the evidence. A careful man preserves it. Before leaving, I placed my phone beneath the passenger seat of the limousine. If anyone tracked it, they would believe I remained inside. Caleb drove me in the black sedan only as far as an access road behind the property, then stopped beside a rusted company pickup. Its battery was dead, but a set of fleet keys hung in the office. We used a portable jump pack from the garage and brought the engine to life. I lay beneath a tarp in the truck bed while Caleb drove the limousine away. The indignity of hiding under oil-stained canvas on my daughter's wedding day should have humiliated me. Instead, I felt the old calm of an investigation returning. Whoever planned my death believed I was emotional, predictable, and eager to preserve appearances. For once, I would let them keep believing it. Caleb returned 27 minutes later in a rideshare car he had ordered under a false name. He climbed into the pickup and told me the limousine had passed both cameras. Exactly as planned. My phone had received 12 more calls. 3 were from Emily, 4 from Richard, 2 from Grant, and the rest from unknown numbers. Grant had also sent a message saying the ceremony would wait as long as necessary. Richard's final voicemail said, "Walt, this isn't funny. People are starting to panic." The word funny told me he was testing a narrative. If I reappeared angry, he could say I had staged a scene. If I remained missing, he could say I was confused. Caleb drove toward Lake Chesdin, where an old friend of mine had owned a fishing cabin before moving to Arizona. I still had permission to use it, and no one in my family knew the place. On the way, I called Denise Parker from a prepaid phone Caleb kept for emergency fares. I gave her only enough information to act. My vehicle had been compromised. Someone had forged trust documents, and I needed an immediate hold placed on any transfer of authority. Denise did not ask whether I was frightened. She asked, "Do you have evidence?" I said. "Enough to know I'm not imagining this. Not enough to know who survives the truth." At Hawthorne Ridge, my absence turned from delay into spectacle. Denise learned the details through public calls and messages before we reached the cabin. Emily had refused to begin the ceremony without me. Grant stood beside her in the bridal suite, telling guests I had become disoriented on the road. Richard informed the estate manager that I had shown signs of memory trouble for months. By noon, the county sheriff's office issued a missing person alert. A local television station posted a photograph of me beside the words, "Prominent businessman missing before daughter's wedding." The article mentioned my age, my recent widowhood, and unnamed relatives' concerns about cognitive decline. Nobody mentioned a rigged sedan. Nobody mentioned forged signatures. The story had been prepared too quickly, Denise said. Someone gave reporters language before law enforcement had facts. I sat at the cabin's small kitchen table, still wearing the borrowed coverall, and listened as my brother converted my attempted murder into evidence that I could not care for myself. The company's general counsel called Denise twice to ask whether the board should appoint an interim chair. 2 directors sent messages expressing concern about market rumors. My disappearance was already doing financial damage, and that damage created the exact justification Richard needed to suspend me. I asked Denise to contact Emily privately, but she advised against it. Any call could be recorded, traced, or presented as evidence that I was unstable. "You cannot sound like a furious father," she said. "You need to sound like a chairman preserving facts." I hated her for being right. Instead of calling my daughter, I listened to her voicemails. In the first, she was frightened. "Dad, please answer. I don't care what happened this week. Just tell me you're safe." In the second, Grant could be heard in the background telling her not to leave the estate. In the third, Emily's fear had turned to anger. "If this is your way of punishing me, I will never forgive you." The fourth broke something in me. She said Richard believed I had suffered a mental episode and that everyone was trying to protect me. Please don't make us find you like this, she whispered. The phrase "like this" revealed how thoroughly they had shaped her understanding. She was not searching for a man under threat. She was searching for an aging father who had become a danger to himself. I nearly called then. Caleb stopped me by placing the forged competency petition Denise had emailed onto the table. They built a story before you disappeared, he said. If you speak now, they'll make every word fit it. Denise obtained the first concrete blow that afternoon. A petition had been filed 3 weeks earlier in Henrico County, requesting a preliminary medical evaluation of my decision-making capacity. It carried Emily's signature and named Richard as the concerned family representative. Attached were notes from a physician named Dr. Stephen Vale, who claimed to have observed signs of memory loss during 2 consultations. I had never met him. The petition had not yet been served because the wedding was cited as a reason to delay formal notice. Denise found that especially troubling. They wanted the filing in place without giving you time to challenge it. She said, if I missed the scheduled evaluations, the petition could be amended to argue that I was avoiding examination. My disappearance would make that argument stronger. Emily had signed the request, but I could not tell whether she understood its full purpose. Denise warned me not to assume innocence simply because the alternative hurt. That was another lesson I had taught younger investigators, and forgotten at home motive should never be assigned before evidence. Yet evidence now placed my daughter's name beneath a false accusation, my brother's name beside it, and a non-existent doctor's observation inside it. The betrayal was no longer emotional. It had paperwork, dates, and a plan. I asked Caleb how Grant had approached him. He said the reservation came through a private transportation broker that handled corporate events. 2 days before the wedding, Grant met him at a coffee shop and offered $5,000 to change the route if instructed. Grant described it as a security precaution because I had received family threats. Caleb accepted $1,000 in cash. He admitted that money had mattered. His younger brother, Jason, owed nearly $40,000 to men running an illegal gambling operation outside Petersburg. Grant knew about the debt and promised to help settle it if Caleb cooperated. The night before the wedding, Caleb was ordered to bring the sedan to the Mercer garage. When he inspected it, he noticed fresh tool marks around the brake line bracket and found the receiver. He confronted Grant by phone. Grant denied knowing anything and reminded him that Jason's probation could be violated if police learned about the gambling room. Caleb understood the warning. I should have gone to the sheriff anyway, he said, but I kept thinking I could get you out and protect my brother at the same time. I told him those 2 goals rarely remain compatible. He answered, neither do loyalty and fear, but families pretend otherwise. By evening, the wedding had officially been postponed. Guests left Hawthorne Ridge carrying garment bags, floral favors, and rumors. Emily remained at the estate with Grant and Richard. Denise's associate spoke to a catering manager who overheard Grant pressuring Richard to activate emergency authority before the banks open Monday. Richard replied that they needed medical support first. That conversation did not prove an assassination plot, but it proved my disappearance was being used immediately to reach my assets. Denise filed notices with the trust's bank, brokerage firms, and Mercer Freight's transfer agent, stating that any change in management authority was disputed. She relied on a protective clause Margaret and I had added years earlier, after a former business partner forged a loan guarantee. The clause froze structural changes when the trustee's capacity was contested, but it still allowed ordinary household and beneficiary expenses. I specifically instructed Denise not to cut off Emily's living allowance or wedding vendors already under contract. She asked whether I was protecting my daughter or protecting my image of myself. I said both. The answer shamed me, but it was true. I could challenge Emily's actions without using money to force her obedience. For the first time, withholding financial punishment felt less like weakness and more like discipline. The next morning, Grant appeared on local television outside Hawthorne Ridge. He wore no tie, and his eyes looked red enough to suggest he had practiced in a mirror. He told the reporter that the family was deeply concerned about my mental state and that I had struggled since Margaret's death. He praised me as a proud man who might resist help. Every sentence sounded compassionate while narrowing the public explanation toward incompetence. When asked whether business pressures could be involved, he said, "Walter has always carried more than one person should. We only want him home safely." I watched from the cabin and recognized the method. Grant was not accusing me. He was inviting strangers to reach the accusation themselves. Richard issued a separate statement through Mercer Freight announcing that the board would meet to ensure continuity of responsible governance. The company's lenders requested assurances. One customer postponed a contract renewal. Employees began calling supervisors to ask whether the business was being sold. My absence had become a lever placed under everything I had built. I wanted to drive straight to Richmond, walk into the boardroom, and expose them. Denise said that was exactly what they expected. An angry entrance helps them, she warned. A documented pattern destroys them. Caleb and I returned to the abandoned garage after midnight to retrieve the sedan's onboard data and examine the limousine dispatch records. We wore gloves and photographed every step. The sedan's navigation system showed a programmed route along River Road, ending near mile marker 17, where the road curved above a steep embankment. The limousine company's system showed that my original route had been altered at 6:42 that morning by an administrative account linked to Mercer Freight's transportation portal. Our company occasionally arranged executive vehicles through that portal, but only 3 employees held administrator credentials: Richard, the operations director, and an information systems manager named Priya Shah. Priya had been attending a conference in Denver since Thursday. The operations director was hospitalized after knee surgery. That left Richard or someone using his credentials. Caleb also recovered a deleted note from the dispatch profile. Passenger may appear confused. Follow family instructions. The note had been entered 4 days before the wedding. Someone had instructed a commercial driver to treat my objections as symptoms. The cruelty of it was almost elegant. They were not simply planning where I would go. They were preparing people to disregard anything I said along the way. At the cabin, Denise arranged a secure video call with Dr. Lena Ortiz, a neuropsychologist she trusted. Dr. Ortiz did not perform a formal evaluation remotely, but she asked enough questions to document that I understood my location, finance, company structure, and legal situation. I answered clearly. She said grief-related distraction could be misrepresented as cognitive decline, especially when family members supplied selective examples. Afterward, Denise told me the call would help, but not end the fight. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting for Tuesday to consider temporarily suspending my voting authority. Richard claimed the company could not function while its chairman was missing and possibly impaired. Under our bylaws, a majority of disinterested directors could impose a temporary restriction pending medical review. Richard had spent years building relationships with those directors. I had spent years assuming ownership made relationships unnecessary. That was my mistake. Authority had allowed me to skip persuasion, and Richard had quietly occupied the space I ignored. I realized then that his resentment might not have begun with money. He had stood beside me for decades while employees thanked me for decisions his numbers made possible. Understanding that did not excuse him, but it explained why betrayal had found fertile ground. Emily left another voicemail late Sunday night. Her voice was calmer, which worried me more than tears. She said she had signed the medical petition because Grant and Richard told her it was only a precaution. She insisted no one intended to take my money. Then she accused me of forcing her to choose between loyalty and adulthood. You decide where I live, whether my work is respectable, who manages my future, and then you call it protection, she said. Maybe I signed because I wanted one thing in my life that didn't require your permission. I listened twice. Her anger was real. So was her participation. I could not reduce her to a victim merely because I loved her. Caleb asked whether I believed she knew about the car. I said no, but realized I was answering as a father rather than an investigator. The honest answer was that I did not know. I remembered the line in the audio. The old man won't question it if the instructions come from his daughter. Emily had called that morning and repeated Richard's vehicle change explanation. Whether knowingly or not, she had helped place me on the route. That knowledge settled in my chest with a weight heavier than fear. On Monday, Denise traced Dr. Stephen Vale's license number and discovered it belonged to a retired pediatrician in Oregon who had died 18 months earlier. The letterhead attached to my competency petition used the address of a vacant medical office in Chesterfield County. The documents were fraudulent from beginning to end. Denise then examined the digital metadata embedded in the earliest file. Its creation date was not 3 weeks before the wedding. It had been generated 11 months earlier. I asked her to repeat that. At that time, Emily had not met Grant. Their first introduction occurred 7 months before the wedding at a charity event Richard had sponsored. The timeline changed everything. Grant could not have originated the competency plan because the plan existed 4 months before he entered my daughter's life. Someone had prepared to remove me long before there was an engagement. A forged signature, or a rigged sen. Denise enlarged the metadata record on the screen. The original file path included an internal Mercer freight server designation assigned to the Chief Financial Officer's office. Richard had not joined Grant's scheme. Grant had joined Richard's, and whatever my brother intended had begun before anyone mentioned love, marriage, or protecting Emily. The file path on Denise's screen ended with a department code I had approved myself 15 years earlier, CFO Private Archive. Only Richard and his executive assistant could create documents inside that directory. The assistant had retired 2 years ago. Richard had built the first version of my medical downfall 11 months before the wedding. Months before Grant entered Emily's life. And only weeks after I rejected Harlan Logistics' purchase offer. I stared at the metadata until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and became a timeline of intent. Denise said, "This does not prove he ordered the car sabotage." I knew that. Evidence has boundaries, and men destroy themselves when they step beyond them. Still, the discovery changed the shape of the betrayal. Grant had not seduced my daughter and then discovered my assets. Richard had selected a vulnerable man, placed him near Emily, and allowed romance to become an instrument. I remembered the charity dinner where they first met. Richard had insisted Emily attend because Grant was exactly the kind of steady person she needed. At the time, I had thanked him. Now I understood that my brother had not introduced my daughter to a future husband. He had introduced her to leverage. Denise began reconstructing the 11-month period from company records. The first competency file was created 9 days after the Harlan board presentation. That meeting had ended badly. Richard had argued the sale would secure our family's wealth for generations. I had argued that Harlan's plan would close 2 terminals, eliminate 114 jobs, and replace local management with a regional hub in Atlanta. Richard called my resistance emotional. I called his numbers incomplete because they ignored severance, customer losses, and pension exposure. In front of the directors, I said, "You're treating people like freight on a spreadsheet." His face had remained still, but his ring tapped the table until another director asked him to stop. Denise found that Richard's employment contract included a transaction bonus equal to 6% of the value above $25 million. If Harlan paid $31 million, his bonus would approach $360,000 immediately, with additional retention compensation exceeding $1.5 million over 2 years. That was enough to explain greed, but not attempted murder. Then Denise uncovered 3 personal guarantees tied to failed commercial real estate investments. Richard needed the sale not only to become rich, he needed it to avoid becoming exposed. The investments were concealed through a consulting company owned by Richard's college roommate. Mercer Freight had paid that company for route optimization services, but the invoices were vague and unusually regular. Denise estimated that nearly $800,000 had moved through the arrangement over 4 years. Some services might have been legitimate. Others looked like company funds redirected to stabilize Richard's private loans. I felt anger rise. Then something more complicated beneath it. Richard had always feared financial humiliation. Our father praised risk and punished failure, and Richard had learned early to hide losses until he could replace them with wins. When we were boys, he once broke a neighbor's window and spent a month repairing bicycles to pay for it before anyone discovered what happened. Our father called him resourceful. I thought he was dishonest. That difference followed us into adulthood. I confronted him publicly whenever numbers failed. He concealed more whenever he feared my judgment. I had believed strictness created accountability. With Richard, it created secrecy. None of that excused fraud. but it showed me the road by which resentment became strategy. Betrayal rarely begins at the moment of action. It begins when someone starts believing injury grants permission. Caleb recovered another fragment from the limousine audio system. The recording began with a door closing and Richard saying, "She trusts him more when he disagrees with her father." Grant replied, "She doesn't trust me. She trusts the version of herself she gets to be around me." The sentence chilled me because it was perceptive. Grant understood Emily's hunger for independence better than I did. Richard then said, "Keep her angry. Anger makes signatures easier." The rest dissolved into static, followed by the tapping of Richard's ring. Denise replayed it 3 times. The conversation did not mention murder, but it established coordination and manipulation. Emily had not accidentally introduced Grant to the trust. She had been guided toward revealing it. I remembered every disagreement Grant had watched in silence. Every moment he stepped in afterward to comfort her. Every time Richard described my caution as control, they had built a closed system around her I would object. Grant would validate her. Richard would provide authority, and Emily would interpret resistance as proof that they were right. My own behavior made the system efficient. Because I had used money to solve problems, Grant only needed to describe every boundary as financial punishment. I had given him a language that fit too easily. We still needed proof connecting Richard to the false medical records beyond the server path. Denise contacted Priya Shah in Denver through a secure channel. Priya confirmed that Richard had requested administrative access to the archive 11 months earlier, claiming he needed to review succession planning. She also remembered an unusual request to preserve old electronic signatures from board documents in a searchable folder. At the time, she assumed it related to audit preparation. Those signatures included mine. Priya agreed to provide a sworn statement, but she warned us that Richard had ordered the company's information technology team to restrict external access after my disappearance. If he realized we were examining metadata, he could wipe logs or claim a cybersecurity incident. We needed an independent forensic image of the server. Denise proposed seeking an emergency court order, but that would alert Richard and trigger open warfare before we understood Grant's role. Caleb suggested physically retrieving the backup drive stored at the company's secondary record site. I refused. Breaking into my own company would still be unlawful and would let Richard portray us as desperate. We would proceed through counsel, even if the slower path placed us at a disadvantage. A revenge built on contaminated evidence becomes another form of surrender. Emily found the cabin on Wednesday afternoon. I heard tires on gravel and reached for the prepaid phone, expecting Caleb or Denise. Instead, Emily stepped from her car wearing jeans, a raincoat, and the exhausted expression of someone who had not slept since the wedding. She stood 10 yards from the porch and said, "I knew Mom brought you here once. Margaret had spent a weekend at the cabin with me 6 years earlier, after one of our worst arguments." I had forgotten telling Emily. She had not. Caleb watched from behind the curtain, ready to leave through the rear door. I told him to stay. Emily climbed the steps slowly, as though approaching an injured animal. When she saw me clearly, relief crossed her face before anger replaced it. She slapped me. The sound startled us both. "You let me think you were dead," she said. I answered, "Someone expected me to be." She accused me of turning the wedding into a performance and humiliating her in front of 200 guests. I did not defend myself immediately. Her pain was real, even if the cause was not what she believed. Then I showed her the photographs of the brake actuator. Emily stared at the images without speaking. She asked whether Caleb had installed it. Caleb stepped into the room and said, "No, ma'am, I found it." She backed away from him and demanded proof. I played the audio from the garage and watched recognition move across her face when Grant's voice said the river route must be clear. She whispered that it could be edited. I agreed. Then I showed her the dispatch instruction describing me as confused and the route change made through Richard's credentials. Her hands began shaking. "Uncle Richard would never hurt you," she said. The statement sounded less like belief than prayer. I asked why she had signed the competency petition. She sat at the kitchen table and admitted Grant had given it to her, after Richard explained that the board needed protection if I became incapacitated. She claimed the medical notes were already attached and had been described as examples, not real findings. I thought it was a draft. She said, I thought my signature only allowed an evaluation. I asked whether she read the document. She looked down. Not all of it. That answer hurt more than a lie. She had signed away my credibility because reading the details felt less important than proving she trusted them. I asked Emily whether she had copied the trust documents. She said she photographed several pages after finding the cabinet key in my desk drawer. Grant told her married couples should understand future assets, and she wanted to show him that I could not disinherit her on impulse. I explained that the trust already protected her beneficiary interest, but restricted immediate control. She said, You never explained that. You just said it was none of my business. She was right. I had treated transparency as a threat to authority. Richard and Grant filled the silence with their own explanations. Emily then admitted she had deleted messages from Grant on the morning of the wedding. He had texted instructions about the vehicle change and told her to repeat them exactly so I would not argue with the driver. He said you were being taken to a private assessment after the ceremony. She said, He said if you knew beforehand, you'd refuse. My throat tightened. Emily had knowingly participated in deceiving me about where the car would take me. She insisted she believed I would be driven to a clinic, not River Road. I wanted to believe her. The investigator in me asked why Grant needed a hidden assessment. The father in me heard only that my daughter had helped place me into a stranger's vehicle. Emily reached for her phone to show me the remaining messages. Before she could unlock it, headlights swept across the cabin windows. 2 sheriff's vehicles stopped outside, followed by Grant's silver SUV. Caleb moved toward the back door, but I told him not to run. Running would convert suspicion into evidence. A deputy knocked and announced he had a temporary order requiring me to undergo immediate psychiatric evaluation because I was considered at risk of self-harm and financial exploitation. Grant stood behind him with rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. His face carried concern so well that I almost admired the performance. Walter, he said softly, please don't make this harder for Emily. I asked to see the order. It had been signed that morning based on affidavits from Emily, Richard, and Dr. Stephen Vale. Emily stared at her name and said she had not signed anything that day. The deputy replied that the affidavit was electronic and had been submitted through counsel. Grant placed a hand on her arm. She pulled away. That small movement told me her certainty had cracked, but not whether it would break in time. Denise answered my call on the first ring. She reviewed a photograph of the order and told me it was legally defective in several ways but still enforceable until challenged. Resisting could allow Grant and Richard to claim I was paranoid and dangerous. She instructed me to cooperate, state clearly that I objected, and request an independent examination. I packed nothing. As the deputies escorted me to the vehicle, I looked at Emily and said, Do not let Grant take your phone. Grant smiled as if I had proven his point. Emily held the phone against her chest. Caleb remained inside the cabin because no warrant named him, but one deputy photographed his identification. I understood they would locate him soon. During the drive, the older deputy treated me respectfully and asked whether I knew the date, the president, and my location. I answered each question, then described the route we were taking and the county line we had crossed. He seemed uncomfortable. You don't appear confused, he said. I replied, Confusion is not required when the paperwork arrives first. He did not respond. I had spent my career watching documents overpower witnesses. Now I was the witness. The facility was a private behavioral health center outside Richmond called Brookfield Assessment Institute. Grant's name did not appear on the building, but Denise quickly found that one of his investment clients owned a minority interest. Dr. Martin Keene introduced himself as the evaluating psychiatrist. He asked whether I believed my family wanted to kill me. I said I possessed evidence that a vehicle assigned to me had been sabotaged. He wrote something without asking to see it. He asked whether I had hidden from my daughter to punish her. I said I hid because a driver warned me that my route was compromised. He wrote again. The pattern was clear. Every fact would be translated into symptom. I changed tactics. I answered slowly, allowed long pauses, and admitted grief had affected my concentration. At the same time, I correctly described my assets. trust structure, board bylaws, medication history, and the legal meaning of the order. Dr. Keene could label me distressed. He could not honestly label me incompetent without contradicting observable facts. I wanted Richard and Grant to hear that I appeared weakened, but I needed the official record to preserve my reasoning. Denise arrived that evening with Dr. Lena Ortiz and demanded an independent assessment. Brookfield delayed access for 3 hours, claiming patient rest rules. During that delay, Richard convened a conference call with Mercer Freight's directors. He argued that my disappearance, public behavior, and involuntary admission justified temporarily suspending my voting rights. 2 directors supported him immediately. Another asked to wait for medical findings. The vote was scheduled for Friday morning, less than 48 hours away. If Richard succeeded, he could revive the Harlan sale, gain access to company records, and strengthen the petition against the trust. Denise told me through the visitation glass, "We are behind." I asked whether Priya had secured the server logs. She said Richard had ordered passwords reset and claimed malware had been detected. He was already cleaning the scene. Then she handed me a printout from Caleb's phone records. Grant had called Caleb 6 times in the week before the wedding. Richard had called him once from a company line 2 minutes after the first competency file was accessed. It was still circumstantial, but the circles were closing. Emily visited the next morning without Grant. She looked smaller in the institutional waiting room, stripped of the wedding dress, the estate, and the people who had told her what to believe. She said Grant had demanded her phone after leaving the cabin. When she refused, he accused her of protecting my manipulation. She asked him directly whether he knew about the brake device. He answered that Caleb was a criminal trying to extort the family. Emily did not believe him completely, but she did not yet believe me completely either. I told her that was fair. Trust should not be granted because someone is family. It should be earned by consistency with evidence. She began crying and said, "You never taught me that. You taught me that whoever paid had the final word." I accepted the blow. She was right again. I had confused provision with leadership and obedience with stability. Grant had exploited that wound, but I had helped create it. I asked Emily to preserve her messages and forward copies to Denise. She agreed. Before leaving, she said Richard planned to announce a temporary leadership transition after Friday's vote. That meant he believed my removal was almost complete. Caleb disappeared Thursday night. He had been scheduled to meet Denise's investigator and provide the original audio files, but he never arrived. His prepaid phone was found near a bus station with the battery removed. The cabin had been searched, though nothing valuable was taken. Whoever entered had opened drawers, lifted floorboards, and cut the lining from an old suitcase. They were looking for the recording or the device photographs. Caleb had stored copies with Denise, but he held the original memory card that could authenticate the files. Without it, Richard's attorneys could argue manipulation. Denise reported his disappearance while Dr. Ortiz completed my independent examination. She found no evidence of dementia, psychosis, or impaired judgment. Only acute stress and complicated grief. Brookfield refused to release me until the court reviewed both reports. I was legally trapped while the man who saved me vanished and my brother prepared to take the company. For the first time since the limousine trunk closed, I felt genuine fear that careful reasoning might not be enough. Evidence mattered only if it survived, and people mattered only if they could still speak. That night, I stopped trying to prove innocence and began planning surrender. Not real surrender. The kind I had seen experienced investigators use when a supervisor falsified reports give the liar the result he expects. Then watch what he changes once he feels safe. I told Dr. Keene I had gaps in my memory from the wedding morning. I said I might have overreacted to family pressure and wanted Richard to stabilize the company. I asked whether signing temporary authority would help Emily feel secure. Dr. Keene's manner changed immediately. He became encouraging. Within an hour, Grant called the facility to ask whether I was ready to cooperate. He should not have known what I said in a confidential session. That breach gave Denise another thread. I instructed her to let Richard believe I would accept a limited transition, provided the formal signing occurred before the full board and trust council. She understood. If they believed I had weakened, They would stop hiding behind doctors and begin arguing over the prize. My plan depended on Grant and Richard distrusting each other more than they feared me. Men united by greed remain partners only while the money seems divisible. At dawn on Friday, minutes before the board meeting, Denise received a scheduled email from Caleb's private account. It contained no message, only a photograph of a small black memory card taped beneath the dashboard of the limousine and a document listing 3 storage locations. Caleb had created a dead man delivery in case he disappeared. One location was the limousine impound lot. Another was Denise's office mailbox. The third was marked only with the initials E.M. Emily Mercer. Before Denise could contact her, Richard's attorney filed an emergency motion accusing me and Caleb of staging the disappearance to manipulate company control. Attached was an edited audio clip in which my voice appeared to say, "Let them think the car was meant to kill me." The sentence had been assembled from separate conversations, but to anyone hearing it once, it sounded convincing. The board postponed the vote for 6 hours and requested police review. Brookfield extended my hold. Grant issued a statement saying he feared I had exploited a vulnerable driver to destroy the wedding. Richard had turned my trap back on me before I could set it. And somewhere outside those locked doors, Emily possessed the only original recording that could prove who had truly planned the road to River Marker 17. Richard believed the edited recording had trapped me, but it gave Denise something he had not considered a reason to demand the source file in court. If his attorneys claimed the clip proved I had staged the disappearance, they would have to authenticate where it came from, who handled it, and whether the original existed. Denise filed an emergency objection before the board reconvened, arguing that no vote affecting my authority should proceed while disputed electronic evidence was being circulated by an interested officer. The judge did not cancel the meeting, but ordered Mercer Freight to preserve every server log, email, access record, and device connected to the audio. Richard had tried to erase the trail and instead placed the entire company under a preservation order. I remained inside Brookfield, outwardly subdued, while Denise told Richard's counsel that I was willing to sign temporary authority if certain conditions were met. He wants peace for his daughter, she said. Richard accepted too quickly. Grant sent Emily a message saying, "Your father finally understands." When Denise read it to me, I felt no satisfaction. A trap only works when the other side believes your surrender is real. And for that to happen, Emily had to believe it too. Dr. Ortiz's report reached the court shortly before noon. She found me competent to manage my affairs. But Brookfield's physician claimed I remained emotionally unstable and recommended another 24 hours of observation. Denise could have fought for immediate release. I told her not to. If I walked out angry and triumphant, Richard would retreat. If I stayed where he believed he had placed me, he might expose the rest of his plan. I asked Brookfield to arrange a monitored call with Emily. She answered after 5 rings. I told her I had decided to step back from Mercer Freight and sign a temporary transition before the wedding was rescheduled. The silence that followed was not relief. It was suspicion. "You don't surrender," she said. I replied, "Maybe that is part of the problem." The words were true enough to hurt. I told her I would not oppose her marriage, would not cancel her trust benefits, and would not demand that she choose between Grant and me. She asked whether I believed Grant tried to kill me. I said, "I believe evidence should answer that, not my anger." I could hear her breathing change. Then she whispered, "What if I already know the answer and I'm afraid to say it?" Emily told me the 3rd memory card from Caleb's dead man delivery had been hidden inside the lining of the wedding garment bag Grant brought to her apartment after the postponed ceremony. Caleb must have placed it there while the limousine was parked at Hawthorne Ridge. She found it only after Richard's edited recording appeared. The card contained the complete original audio, including several minutes omitted from every copy Denise had received. Emily had listened alone. In it, Grant asked Richard whether the brake device could be traced. Richard replied, "Not if the car goes where we planned." Grant then said he wanted no part of a body, and Richard answered that accidents did not create bodies for people willing to stop looking. The recording did not capture a direct order, but it destroyed Richard's claim that he knew nothing about sabotage. Emily also heard herself discussed as if she were an account to be managed. Grant said once they married, she would sign whatever he placed in front of her because she feared losing the first man who made her feel independent. Richard laughed and said, "Independence is just dependency with better language." Emily's voice broke as she repeated the line. I wanted to comfort her, but I knew comfort from me often came with control. I said only, "Keep the cards safe. Do not tell Grant." Denise arranged for Emily to deliver a forensic copy to an independent digital examiner and keep the original with a criminal defense attorney unrelated to Mercer Freight. That separation mattered. If Emily handed the card directly to me, Richard could claim family manipulation. If she gave it to police before we understood the chain of evidence, Grant might learn through his contacts and destroy remaining records. We needed to move carefully without becoming the thing they accused us of being. Meanwhile, the board held its delayed meeting. I attended by secure video from Brookfield, wearing a plain shirt instead of my wedding suit. Richard sat at the head of the conference table as though the seat had always belonged to him. He expressed sorrow over my decline and proposed a 30-day suspension of my voting rights. I surprised everyone by saying I would accept a narrower arrangement, temporary delegation of day-to-day operations, provided no sale, merger, asset transfer, executive bonus, or trust-related action occurred without a full conflict review. Richard objected that the restrictions would paralyze the company. That objection revealed his priority. If his concern had truly been stability, ordinary operations would have satisfied him. He wanted transaction power, not management responsibility. The directors adopted my limited proposal by a 4-3 vote. Richard smiled because he believed it weakened me. He did not realize the company bylaws contained an old provision Margaret had insisted we add after our former partner forged a loan guarantee. If evidence showed that a senior officer stood to receive an undisclosed personal benefit from a transaction, voting authority over that transaction automatically shifted to a temporary committee of 3 disinterested directors. The rule had never been used. Richard probably remembered it as irrelevant language buried in a document no one read. Denise quietly sent the directors the compensation schedule tied to the Harlan sale, Richard's hidden guarantees, and the consulting company invoices. She did not yet accuse him of theft. She asked only that the conflict committee be activated pending review. 2 directors who had supported Richard agreed immediately, not because they trusted me, but because they feared personal liability. By evening, Richard could still run payroll, negotiate routine contracts, and speak publicly as acting chief executive. He could not complete the Harlan transaction without the committee. I had given him the title while separating him from the prize. He believed he was closer to victory than ever. Caleb was found that night at a small hospital in Dinwiddie County. A delivery driver had discovered him unconscious behind a closed service station. He had a fractured rib, a concussion, and bruising around both wrists. Nothing on him identified his attackers. His wallet remained, but the original phone, memory card, and $5,000 from Grant were gone. Denise's investigator reached him before Richard's attorneys learned he was alive. Caleb admitted he had withheld part of the truth. He had not merely accepted money to alter the route. He had also entered a false maintenance note stating the sedan had passed inspection. Grant paid him because the note would make the brake failure look unexpected. Caleb said he planned to correct the record after the wedding, but fear for Jason kept him silent. I was part of it until I saw what they built, he told the investigator. That confession complicated everything. Richard could portray Caleb as a participant inventing accusations to save himself. I did not want Denise to hide his role. A witness becomes stronger when his guilt is acknowledged before the other side reveals it. Caleb agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and accept responsibility for falsifying the inspection record. He had saved my life, but saving me did not erase what he had done before choosing courage. Richard struck back the next morning. He fired Priya Shah for alleged cybersecurity negligence and suspended 2 terminal managers known to oppose the Harlan sale. He ordered the company's outside public relations firm to announce that internal sabotage by disgruntled employees may have contributed to my disappearance. He also froze access to the records archive, claiming the court's preservation order required isolation. Denise petitioned for a neutral forensic examiner, but the hearing would not occur for several days. Time favored Richard because Harlan's offer expired at the end of the month. He scheduled a special shareholder meeting at Hawthorne Ridge for the following Friday, the same date Emily and Grant had privately selected to hold a smaller wedding ceremony. Combining the events was meant to produce emotional pressure. If I objected to the sale, Richard would accuse me of disrupting Emily's wedding again. If I objected to the marriage, Grant would say I was using the company to control my daughter. They planned to make every defense look like another symptom of my possessiveness. I recognized the elegance because it resembled my own worst habits, placing family and business inside the same room, then using one to influence the other. Grant visited Emily at the guest house that afternoon. She had returned there because he believed proximity to my property would reassure her. She activated an audio recorder Denise had approved under Virginia's one-party consent law because she was a participant in the conversation. Grant apologized for pressuring her and blamed Richard for the vehicle plan. He admitted knowing they intended to divert me to a clinic, but claimed he learned about the sabotage only afterward. Emily asked why he discussed whether the brake device could be traced. Grant paused, then said Richard had frightened him into staying silent. He took her hands and told her they could still marry, secure her trust rights, and use the money to escape Richard's control. Once we're husband and wife, he can't isolate you from your own future, Grant said. Emily asked what she would need to sign. He produced a postnuptial asset management agreement granting him broad authority over investment decisions involving any distributions she received. The document had been prepared before the wedding date. He had carried it into the guest house, expecting her fear to do the rest. Emily pretended to consider it. She said she would sign after the ceremony if he helped convince Richard to stop attacking me publicly. Grant agreed. His greed had made him cooperative. When Emily sent me the recording, I heard more than proof. I heard my daughter learning to remain calm while someone underestimated her. That should have made me proud. Instead, it reminded me how many years I had mistaken her dependence for weakness. She had always observed more than I credited. I simply intervened before she could act. The plan now became clearer. Emily would proceed as if the wedding were still happening. I would publicly accept retirement and appear willing to sign limited trust documents at Hawthorne Ridge. Richard would expect the shareholder meeting to approve Harland. Grant would expect marriage to give him leverage over Emily's beneficiary interest. Each man believed the other would remain useful until the signatures were complete. Our goal was not to surprise them with a secret witness or a miraculous confession. It was to place verified evidence in front of them and ask questions neither could answer without blaming the other. Denise warned that one of them might refuse to speak. I said they would speak because silence required trust, and neither man trusted his partner enough to carry the entire risk. I left Brookfield after the court accepted Dr. Ortiz's findings. Reporters waited outside. Denise advised me to say nothing, but I stopped at the steps and made one statement. My family is under strain. My company is reviewing serious internal issues, and I will not try this matter in public. Richard later called it proof that I had no defense. Grant told Emily I looked defeated. That was useful. I returned home for the first time since the wedding and found the study disturbed. The trust cabinet had been opened, although the new lock showed no damage. Someone had used a duplicate key or a locksmith. Several harmless copies were missing, including an old trust summary that misstated Emily's rights because it predated Margaret's amendments. I realized Grant might believe that outdated version still governed the trust. It suggested Emily could assume management immediately upon my incapacity and appoint an advisor of her choice. The current document required court review and independent fiduciary approval. I could have corrected his misunderstanding. Instead, I allowed Emily to mention casually that she had found the trust summary in my study. Grant's response was immediate. He asked her to bring it to the wedding. He was preparing to rely on a document that had no legal force. Our plan suffered its first serious failure 2 days before the meeting. Richard obtained a copy of Caleb's hospital statement through an investigator and released the portion admitting he falsified the sedan inspection. He omitted Caleb's explanation and cooperation. Local coverage shifted. Commentators questioned whether Caleb and I had invented the sabotage after a financial dispute. One director withdrew support for the conflict committee and said he would abstain. Without him, the Harland vote might pass if Richard persuaded 2 family shareholders who held small inherited stakes. Worse, Emily received an anonymous package containing the edited recording and photographs of me meeting Caleb months earlier. The photographs were real but misleading. Caleb had driven me to an airport during a business trip in January. The images made it appear we had a prior relationship. Emily called and asked whether I had secretly hired him before the wedding. I told her the truth. I recognized him only after he mentioned working in our fleet years ago. She wanted proof I was not manipulating her again. I had none that could erase every doubt. This time, I did not demand belief. I said, choose based on what survives examination, even if that choice is not me. She ended the call without answering. For 12 hours. I thought we had lost her. Grant remained at the guest house, and Richard's car was seen entering the property after midnight. Denise advised canceling the plan because Emily might reveal the memory card or refuse to participate. I refused to assume betrayal without evidence, even though experience gave me every reason to fear it. At dawn, Emily sent a single message: keep the ceremony schedule. She had discovered that the anonymous package used the same courier account Grant employed for his investment office. He had manufactured doubt and delivered it as concern. Instead of confronting him, she apologized for questioning him and agreed to sign the asset management agreement after the vows. Grant then told Richard that Emily was back under control. Richard replied in a text recovered from Emily's screen. Good. Once the shares transfer. He is unnecessary. The pronoun was unclear. He could have meant Grant, Caleb, or me. But Grant interpreted it as a threat. Within an hour, he asked Emily whether Richard could remove him from the trust arrangement after the sale. She said she did not know. The alliance began to fracture exactly where we needed it to. On Friday morning, Hawthorne Ridge looked almost identical to the day I disappeared. White chairs faced the garden, the string quartet tuned beneath the same oak trees. Inside the ballroom, a long table held shareholder packets, Harlan's purchase agreement, and a folder containing the outdated trust summary Grant believed would secure his future. Richard moved between rooms with the confidence of a man hosting both a wedding and a coronation. Grant wore the charcoal suit he had chosen for the original ceremony. Emily remained upstairs in a simpler dress, guarded by bridesmaids who believed the family had reconciled. Caleb entered through a service corridor with his attorney and 2 investigators, keeping out of sight until called. Priya arrived under subpoena with a neutral forensic specialist. Denise stood beside me at the front entrance and asked whether I was ready. I told her readiness had nothing to do with it. I had lost the luxury of choosing the moment. When the doors opened, every conversation stopped. I walked into the ballroom wearing the navy suit Margaret had chosen and carrying Caleb's black memory card case in my hand. Then I looked at Richard, Grant, and my daughter and said, before anyone signs a contract or speaks a vow, this family is going to hear what was said when you thought I would never reach this room. Richard recovered first. He gave a thin smile, spread one hand over the shareholder packets, and said, Walt, this is neither the time nor the place. I looked at the white chairs visible through the ballroom windows and answered, you chose the place when you scheduled a corporate vote beside my daughter's wedding. Grant stepped toward Emily, but she remained near the staircase, beyond his reach. Denise placed 3 sealed evidence folders on the table and asked the Harlan attorneys to remain because the proposed sale depended on representations made by Mercer Freight's chief financial officer. One of them immediately requested a recess. Richard refused. He wanted the vote completed before the room changed sides. That impatience was the first crack. I asked him whether he had created a competency file 11 months earlier. He said no. Priya Shah connected a laptop to the ballroom display and showed the preserved metadata from the CFO private archive. Richard dismissed it as compromised. Then Denise displayed his access request for stored executive signatures. He said it was ordinary succession planning. I asked why succession planning required a dead pediatrician's license number. The room went silent. And for the first time, Richard looked toward Grant instead of at me. Grant understood the glance as accusation. I had nothing to do with documents created before I met Emily. He said quickly. Richard turned on him. Nobody said you did. Grant realized his mistake a second too late. He had confirmed the timeline before Denise presented it. One of the Harlan lawyers closed the purchase agreement and moved it away from Richard. I continued calmly. The medical petition had been built before Grant entered the family. but someone later inserted Emily's electronic signature, my copied signature, and Dr. Vale's false observations. Emily stepped forward and said she signed what Grant described as a preliminary evaluation request, not the document filed with the court. Grant replied that Richard's attorney handled the final submission. Richard said Grant supplied Emily's credentials. Each answer moved responsibility without denying the plan existed. Denise then played the unedited limousine recording. Richard's ring tapped against wood through the speakers. His voice said, "Not if the car goes where we planned." Grant's voice asked whether the brake device could be traced. No one moved while the recording continued into their discussion of Emily. When Richard called Independence dependency with better language, she removed her engagement ring and placed it beside the shareholder packet. Grant's face changed when the ring touched the table. Until that moment, he had believed he could lose the company deal and still preserve the marriage. "Emily, you know how this sounds without context," he said. She looked at him with a steadiness I had never allowed her enough room to develop. "Then give me the context." Grant said Richard had designed the competency scheme and threatened him after the vehicle plan became dangerous. Richard laughed once. Without humor, he accepted cash, arranged the driver, and prepared the asset agreement before the wedding. Grant pointed at him and said, "You supplied the garage, the route, and the receiver." Richard answered, "I supplied a car for a medical intervention. You were the one who said an accident solved more problems." The words landed harder than any accusation I could have made. Denise asked both men to repeat their statements for the record. Grant went pale as he noticed two investigators near the service entrance. Richard stopped speaking, but silence had arrived too late. They had exposed the division of labor themselves. Richard created the legal foundation. Grant manipulated Emily and coordinated Caleb. And both knew the sedan was not intended to deliver me safely to a clinic. Caleb entered with his attorney and walked carefully because of his fractured rib. Richard called him a paid liar before he reached the table. Caleb did not defend his character. He admitted accepting $1,000, falsifying the vehicle inspection note, and agreeing to misdirect the limousine. Then he described finding the remote actuator and deciding not to transfer me into the sedan. His attorney presented photographs taken in the garage before the device was removed, along with the dispatch profile that labeled me confused. The county investigator confirmed the actuator had been recovered under chain of custody procedures and was capable of restricting hydraulic pressure when activated. Grant insisted he never touched it. Caleb replied, "You didn't need to. You gave me the phone that paired with the receiver." The phone itself had disappeared when Caleb was attacked, but the limousine platform had logged its device identifier during testing. Priya matched that identifier to a handset purchased through Grant's consulting office. No single piece proved every act, but together they formed a structure too consistent to dismiss. Richard looked at me and said, "You built this company on circumstantial judgment." I answered, "No. I built it by noticing when separate failures all served the same person." Denise moved to the corporate evidence next. She presented Richard's transaction bonus, personal guarantees, and the consulting invoices linked to his college roommate. The Harland attorneys immediately stated they had not been informed of those conflicts. Richard argued that the payments reflected legitimate advisory work and that his compensation had been approved years earlier. Denise did not accuse him of theft in that room. She did not need to. She invoked the conflict provision in Mercer Freight's bylaws, the same provision Richard had overlooked because it had never before been used. The three-member independent committee had reviewed the documents that morning and voted to suspend Richard from all authority connected to the Harland transaction, pending forensic audit. He demanded to know when the committee had met. One director answered, "While you were arranging flowers." Without Richard's vote and with two minority shareholders abstaining after learning of the undisclosed compensation, the sale lacked approval. The Harland representatives withdrew their offer rather than sign amid active fraud and governance disputes. Richard watched the deal disappear, along with the bonus he needed to cover his private guarantees. Power had always mattered to him, but control of the sale mattered more. That was where the counterstrike landed. Grant still believed the trust could save him. He opened the folder containing the outdated summary and said Emily's beneficiary rights became active if I was medically incapacitated. Denise asked him to read the document date. It preceded Margaret's final amendments by 6 years. Then she placed the current trust instrument beside it. Under the governing version, Emily remained a future beneficiary, but no spouse, advisor, or family member could assume management without court approval and consent from an independent fiduciary. My temporary hospitalization had never activated anything. The forged petition had no legal effect. Grant's prepared postnuptial agreement could govern only assets Emily actually received and voluntarily placed under his management. She had received none. He stared at the outdated summary as if the pages had betrayed him. I told him I had known he took it from my study and allowed him to believe it mattered. You built your future around a document you never verified, I said. His career depended on appearing more financially sophisticated than everyone around him. Losing money would hurt him. Being exposed as careless in front of lawyers, investors, and Emily destroyed the identity he valued most. He closed the folder slowly and said nothing else. Emily turned toward the garden, where guests had begun gathering because no one had told them the ceremony was delayed. She asked Grant one final question. When you proposed, did you already know about the trust? He hesitated. Richard answered for him. Of course he did. Grant said he loved her, even if the introduction had been arranged. Emily replied, maybe you loved how easy I was to separate from my father. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. Then she lifted the ring from the table and placed it in his palm. You did not love me. You loved the door you thought I could open. The sentence was quiet, but it reached everyone in the ballroom. She walked outside and told the guests the wedding would not take place. She did not explain the financial scheme or ask for sympathy. She simply thanked them for coming and asked the venue staff to serve the meal to anyone who wished to stay. That choice was the first adult decision she made that day without consulting me. I did not follow her immediately. Loving her meant allowing the consequences to belong to her, not rushing forward with money, instructions, or protection. The investigators separated Grant, Richard, and Caleb for formal interviews. No one was handcuffed in the ballroom, and I was grateful for that. This was not a victory that required spectacle. Over the following weeks, prosecutors reviewed potential charges involving forged records, attempted financial exploitation, vehicle tampering, conspiracy, and obstruction. Grant's advisory license was placed under investigation after several clients learned he had used company resources to purchase the paired phone. Richard resigned from Mercer Freight before the board could remove him, though the resignation did not stop the forensic audit. The audit confirmed improper related party payments and undisclosed guarantees. Caleb pleaded to falsifying the inspection record and received consideration for cooperation. But he did not escape responsibility. I paid none of his legal bills. I did, however, provide truthful testimony about his decision to save my life, even though doing so complicated the clean story people wanted. Caleb had been afraid, compromised, and late to courage. He had also acted when it mattered most. Human beings are often both guilty and brave within the same hour. I had spent too much of my life sorting people into useful categories. Richard asked to meet me privately before his attorney advised him to stop speaking. We sat in the empty conference room where he had tapped our father's ring against the table. He looked older than he had at the wedding, not because of prison or public shame, but because the future he had arranged was gone. You always thought I was weak, he said. I told him I thought he was secretive, which was not the same thing. He said I had taken credit for every success and turned every disagreement into proof that I was morally superior. I could have denied it. Instead, I admitted that I had humiliated him in meetings and treated final authority as evidence of final wisdom. Richard's eyes filled, but his voice remained hard. And now you want me to say that drove me to kill you? I answered, no. I want us both to understand that my failures explain the distance between us. They do not excuse what you chose to do with it. He asked whether I would cut him from the family trust. I told him his personal inheritance remained protected under Margaret's terms, but he would never again manage company or trust assets. Consequences did not require revenge beyond what the facts justified. Emily moved out of the guest house 30 days later. I gave her written notice, not because I wanted to punish her, but because remaining there would preserve the same dependency that had made Grant's manipulation possible. She returned to event management at a small hotel near downtown Richmond and rented an apartment she could afford without my help. I stopped paying her monthly expenses. I did not remove her as a future beneficiary because Margaret and I had designed the trust to protect her from impulsive decisions, including mine. Emily began repaying funds she had used from a wedding account for personal purchases Grant encouraged. The amounts were modest compared with what I had spent. But the act mattered. For several months, our conversations were brief and uncomfortable. She apologized more than once for signing the petition and hiding the vehicle plan. I told her forgiveness would not restore trust on a schedule. She accepted that. I also apologized for using provision as a substitute for presence and for making every disagreement feel like a test she could pass only by obeying me. She did not forgive me immediately either. That seemed fair. Mercer Freight survived the scandal, though we lost customers and spent heavily on audits, legal reviews, and governance reforms. I gave up the power to make unilateral decisions on major transactions and added 2 long-serving employees to the board. Priya returned as Chief Technology Officer with direct reporting authority to the Audit Committee. We created stronger controls around related party contracts, electronic signatures, and executive transportation. I remained chairman for 1 year, then moved into a non-executive role. The old version of me would have called that surrender. The man who walked out of Brookfield understood it as structure. Companies fail when they depend on one person's judgment, even when that person believes his judgment is superior. Families fail for similar reasons. I sold the large house where every room carried evidence of Margaret and every hallway invited people to fight over what came next. I kept the small cabin near Lake Chesden, repaired the porch, and placed Margaret's photograph above the fireplace. The first night there alone, I heard no ringing phone, no tapping ring, and no one asking me to sign anything. The quiet felt less like loneliness than truth. 6 months after the canceled wedding, Emily came to the cabin carrying 2 paper bags from a local restaurant. She had paid for dinner herself and mentioned that fact only by handing me the receipt when I reached for my wallet. We ate on the porch while the lake darkened beyond the trees. She told me she had been promoted to senior events manager and was learning how to handle angry clients without promising things the hotel could not deliver. I said that sounded useful. She smiled and replied, "It turns out boundaries work better when you explain them." The line was pointed, but not cruel. After dinner, she asked whether I believed Grant had ever loved her. I told her I believed he may have felt something real, but he valued access, control, and rescue more than love. People can care for someone and still choose to exploit them. She asked whether I still loved Richard. I looked across the water before answering. "Yes," I said, "but love is not permission to return someone's power." Emily nodded as though she understood that the answer applied to both of us. I did not recover the family I thought I had before the wedding. That family had existed partly because I refused to examine it closely. Richard and I never reconciled. Grant disappeared from Emily's life except through legal notices. Caleb rebuilt his work slowly after completing probation and paying restitution. Emily and I learned to speak without contracts between us, though some days the old patterns returned, and one of us had to step back. I kept control of my life, but not without loss. The most painful discovery was not that people wanted my money or company. It was that my generosity had often been another form of control, and their resentment had grown in the spaces where honest conversation should have been. Still, my mistakes did not make their betrayal inevitable. They made it easier, not excusable. The morning a driver locked me in a trunk. I thought survival meant escaping a rigged car. Months later, I understood survival meant something quieter, refusing to let fear, guilt, or blood decide who deserved access to my trust. I had spent a lifetime protecting assets. At last, I learned to protect the part of myself that no signature should ever transfer.